The Yalta Blueprint. So what we're going to do in this particular module is to explore the Grand Alliance by looking at the basic background and the negotiations that shaped the Yalta Agreement in February 1945. And the question we want to explore is whether this agreement either sealed the Grand Alliance's determination to crush Hitler and defeat the Axis powers, or if instead this agreement was nothing but an agreement to leave one's disagreements for another time, and therefore was in essence the start of the Cold War. So to understand what Churchill had dubbed the Grand Alliance, we really got to go a little bit back in time. In particular, the British and the Russians had made a defense pact, relatively soon after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. But the United States was not on board with that. The United States was an ally of Britain. Britain was an ally of the Soviet Union. There was a special relationship between the United States and Britain, but the United States was very suspicious of Stalin. The American evangelicals were very hostile to communism. The United States and FDR in particular were very sore at Stalin for his invasion of the Baltic countries, and particularly later Finland. So in this sense, the Yalta Blueprint is the way that these kind of unnatural partners came to be allies with a solemn commitment to defeat Nazi Germany. Now we can start perhaps by analyzing the Casablanca Conference, which was obviously held in Morocco, and the picture there shows you FDR and Churchill sitting down, and of course also the big peacock, General Charles de Gaulle, present. And if there's one thing that FDR and Churchill agreed upon, is that de Gaulle was a pretentious bastard that still imagined himself or France as being a great power, when it was evident to them and everyone else that France had been defeated by Germany, and that most of France was in an alliance, essentially, if not neutral, at least in the orbit of Nazi Germany. So one of the agreements that FDR and Churchill hammered out at the Casablanca Conference was the idea of unconditional surrender. The reason they reached this determination is in part because they didn't want to repeat the mistakes of Versailles, where they had not, in a way, occupied their defeated enemy and forced through meaningful changes that would have, truly restored security. So they were determined not to make that mistake again. Now, Stalin had been, in a way, invited. He was, I don't know what vehicle he would have used to come there, but he didn't travel to Casablanca. And when he was told that, his Western partners had agreed on unconditional surrender, he said that, okay, I can live with that. On the other hand, he also let it be known that in the future, as a full partner, he should be consulted on these bigger deals. Eventually, the unconditional surrender condition is going to be pretty significant because it underscored the mistrust between Stalin and the West. Both sides were allied and united with an antipathy of Nazi Germany, determination to destroy it, seeing it as the major menace to world peace. In this existential struggle, both for Britain and for the Soviet Union and for the United States as well, they were willing to bury their ideological differences between liberal democracy and socialist revolution and communism. On the other hand, they were very mistrusting of each other, lest in the midst of the alliance one party would change sides. So unconditional surrender became, in a way, a very important way to solidify the Stalin-Western partnership and to maintain their unity through the vagaries of war to ensure that there was no backstabbing that took place if the opportunity presented itself. Now, the Tehran Conference in July 1943 was very significant. The first reason it was significant is because you can see it was the first meeting of the big three. So the leaders of the major powers against Hitler came together. It also came together in a context in the war and a process in their relationship. This conference came on the heels of the Battle of Stalingrad, which was a brutal defeat for Germany that underscored that they had no chance of victory on the Eastern Front. And there's considerable evidence that there was some type of contact between Stalin trying to ascertain whether Hitler might be open to an armistice. In other words, ending the war in the East, or at least creating an armistice that would have enabled, in a way, Hitler to concentrate his efforts on Britain and the West. Now, nothing ever came from this agreement. We might even argue or suspect that Stalin wasn't even sincere in such a deal, although we can't completely determine that. What is significant is that the West got news of these dealings, or at least rumors about them, and that we see is that as a result of this hardline bargaining by Stalin, the West became more amenable to the idea of granting the Soviet Union territorial advantages after World War II. So in particular, the Allies and the Americans agreed to essentially violate the Atlantic Charter relative to territorial adjustments, and they agreed to Stalin's scheme about shifting Poland west. So by shifting Poland west, it would go into Germany, it would make Germany smaller, but it would also enable Stalin to claim Eastern Poland as his own territory. This territory of Eastern Poland was also essentially the territory that Hitler had promised him under the Ribbentrop-Molotov Agreement, in areas and land that they had occupied in 1939. Now, given that the war's turning point had been reached, given that the Soviet Union, the Red Army, was essentially inflicting 90% of the Wehrmacht's casualties, in other words, they were doing the heavy lifting in the war, Stalin had a very strong bargaining position, and essentially by pretending or letting the West know that he was considering cutting a deal with Hitler, they came to the table, and the United States in particular agreed that since Stalin was doing the heavy lifting and the Soviet Union was so destroyed by the Nazi Vernichtungskrieg that the Soviet Union was entitled to compensation for this war effort, compensation in this sense relative to the territory of Eastern Poland, but also implicitly relative to future reparations, whether that came in the form of money or resources, or during the war in terms of Lend-Lease. Both the United States and Britain upped their quota, shipped more and more goods to the Red Army, and in this way were backing the Red Army's fight that it was taking to Germany. Now, the Yalta Conference started in January 1945 and ended in early February. It's important to point out that after the Battle of the Bulge, Germany was facing defeat. It was only Hitler's intransigence that was essentially delaying this. The Western armies were on the doorsteps of Germany, already in Germany, and poised to end the conflict. So what we want to do to understand the Yalta Conference is try to understand, how do we interpret this? There's been essentially different historical perspectives. One idea is that the Yalta Conference was the beginning of the Cold War because the differences between what Stalin wanted and the West wanted, particularly relative to Poland and Eastern Europe, became the dividing issues that would eventually, after World War II, separate into a gulf and then trigger the Cold War partitioning of Europe. But there's also a more kind of sympathetic view that in a way these differences were unbridgeable. So in that sense, the Yalta Conference was the best deal possible in February 1945 because the key object of the Grand Alliance was to destroy Nazi Germany. And what they did is essentially reach an agreement on that point, even if they weren't able to do the heavy lifting in terms of resolving their other differences regarding Germany, reparations, the future status of Eastern Europe. Now, one of the ways that we can analyze the Yalta Conference is to essentially do it from a negotiator's perspective, try to figure out what all of the big three wanted, look at the agreement, and then score the outcome. Who got the most of what they wanted? So looking at the Yalta Conference from that way, what FDR really wanted was to keep Stalin in the Grand Alliance. And this was particularly true because in the wake of Iwo Jima, it was very clear that Japan was going to resist to the last soldier. And as a result, the heavy casualties the United States was suffering, the immense casualties they were forecast to suffer in an invasion of the home islands, they wanted to have the assistance of the Red Army. Since the Red Army and the Soviet Union and Asia bordered the Japanese Empire, they would be able to redeploy and particularly attack the Kwantung Army in China. So one of the things that Roosevelt wanted was to keep Stalin on board so that they would help in the business of bringing Japan to defeat, because once Nazi Germany was defeated, Japan was still going to be able to resist. FDR also put a lot of faith in the United Nations, and more generally, he not only wanted the Soviet Union to be part of the United Nations, but he believed that the partnership between the United States and the Soviet Union would endure after World War II and would be essentially the foundation for a more stable post-war order. So he wanted to, in a sense, involve Stalin and have his commitment to join this international system that he was a leading architect of. Now, Roosevelt also understood that the Americans had mobilized reluctantly, and there would be immediate calls to bring the troops home. So as soon as Germany surrendered, he would have to demobilize the army, and essentially this meant that American leverage would erode. So he had an incentive to go as far as possible with Yalta, to make it as the most comprehensive deal possible, because if he had to negotiate it later, American leverage would diminish, and the leverage would kind of slide to the Soviet side. Now, relative to Winston Churchill, he was an ardent communist, and he was very suspicious of Stalin. He was a lot more skeptical about FDR's liberal vision and about the United Nations and having Stalin a partner in that. He was fully on board with using Stalin to attack Germany and the indispensability of the Red Army in accomplishing that. On the other hand, he also didn't trust the Russians, in particular their aims in Eastern Europe. So he also knew that he had to keep Stalin in the Grand Alliance, but since he didn't trust him, he went on an embassy. He actually jumped on a plane, went a very long voyage to Moscow, and he conducted a personal embassy with Comrade Stalin. And during a kind of a cocktail party, which wasn't the normal venue for making diplomatic agreements, he tried to get Stalin to agree to essentially dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. So one of the stories goes he has this cocktail napkin. He writes down all the countries of Eastern Europe, and he writes Greece 90% Britain, 10% Soviet Union, Poland 80% Soviet Union, 20% Britain, and Romania 90% Soviet Union, 10% Britain. And when he handed this to Stalin, Stalin signed it and kind of threw it on the cocktail table. And Churchill kind of believed, okay, this is a deal we got. Whereas from Stalin's point of view, this was very insulting, because essentially what Britain was trying to do was to get a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe that had been liberated exclusively by Russian blood. So this was, in a way, highlighting the discrepant interests and discrepant desires between Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, particularly for Eastern Europe. Now, what did Comrade Stalin want? We have access to some of the testimonies of those closest to him, his journals and other diplomatic records with the end of the Cold War, so we can, in a much fuller way, understand what he was thinking at Yalta. The first thing about Stalin's view of Yalta is that he felt a lot of resentment towards the West. In particular, he was resentful that the West delayed opening a Western front. Now, in a sense, this was unfair, because even the D-Day invasion in 1944 was very, very risky, and it would have been impossible, really, for Allied forces before that time to establish a beachhead on Western Europe. But he was also resentful for a very particular thing, and that was with the Allied invasion, the British and American invasion of mainland Italy, and the surrender of Italy. The Allies had accepted this unilaterally without incorporating the Soviet Union into the deal. So Stalin saw this as a violation of the terms of their alliance. He also resented it because Italian troops were fighting on the Russian front against the Soviet Union. And this symbolized to him that the West was using Russia and the Red Army for its own ends. And as soon as the war was over, they would reset to being the capitalist powers and try to subvert the Soviet Union and undermine the Communist Party's influence throughout Eastern Europe. Now, that being said, Stalin probably was also the one person at the table that was the most realistic. If we talk about realpolitik, he was not going to be deceived about liberal language. From his point of view, they were there to make a deal. They were different powers. They all wanted things. And what they were there to accomplish at Yalta was to reach the fairest deal possible to all sides. One of the things that he was hoping to secure, given the fact that the Soviet Union was going to win the war militarily and essentially lose it economically in terms of the complete destruction of their economy and their infrastructure, is that he was looking to find reparations, whether it was money, land, resources, territory, so that he would be able to rebuild a devastated Soviet Union. Another thing that the Soviet Union wanted was a buffer zone. 3 times in the last 150 years, Russia had been invaded from the west, not from the east, particularly through Poland. So it was, the lessons of history were very clear. If the Soviet Union was going to be secure, they needed to have a buffer zone because that would make the pathway to the Soviet Union longer and they'd be able to stop them in Eastern Europe before these invading Western armies came onto Western territory and caused all this damage. Now, related to this security was, of course, resolving the so called German question. Germany needs to be disarmed, it needed to be weakened. How that was to be done, well, no one was quite in agreement. There were different ideas. Stalin was definitely in that camp. Germany needs to be disarmed. How that needs to be done, he was, in a sense, flexible. Another thing that we see about the Soviet Union is that Stalin was very conscious of the fact that he, although he had military leverage, economically the Soviet Union was weak. The United States was going to emerge not only militarily victorious, but also the economic hegemon. And the Soviet Union was looking for reparations, money. In some way or another, the United States was in a position to provide it. And in order to get it, he had to, in a way, acquiesce to what the United States wanted. And he understood that he had to negotiate with the United States and give them what they wanted on certain key questions without necessarily compromising core Soviet needs. He was not in any way interested in continuing the war or fighting the capitalist powers. He knew how exhausted economically, psychologically the Soviet people were. He was the weaker power. But on the other hand, he wasn't going to just pussyfoot out of this agreement either. He was going to strike the biggest bargain possible. He was there to get what the Soviet Union needed as core agreements. Another thing that motivated Stalin that we figured out from looking at his records is that he kind of looked at World War II the way the end game of World War I, where there've been all these socialist revolutions, and from his point of view, capitalism was doomed. Many communist parties had strengthened in Eastern and Western Europe. After World War II, Western Europe was devastated. Capitalism was bound to collapse. It wasn't necessarily going to require the Soviet Union to subvert Western democracy. Capitalism was going to collapse on its own. So that wasn't really a big goal of his at Yalta. And then there was the personality angle as well, because the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin, it's hard to distinguish where one started and the other started. He was such a dominant figure, and essentially he was the state. So in that sense, his ego, his psychological, his unconsciousness became an important part of the history as well. And we know that he was very gratified in being part of the big boys club. He had been a pariah during, ever since Versailles during the 1930s. Now he had a seat at the big boy table. He was accepted as a major power. He was negotiating the future of the world. And this gratified him, but it also made him insecure in the sense that he was always looking for some slight, looking for verification. Oh, they're only using me. They're going to betray me. They're going to stab me in the back. His, in a way, his suspicion, his doubts were, in a way, a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, if we look at the Yalta Agreement, what we see is that elements of what all the parties wanted are reflected in there. So in that sense, you might score this a fair deal. So Stalin agreed to participate, to join the war in Japan 6 weeks after the war in Germany, or the peace in Germany, was concluded, and he honored that deal, attacking the Japanese army in China. He also agreed after Yalta to join the United Nations, which they were negotiating apart. Another legacy of the Yalta Accord, which would later be very significant because it becomes the boundary line of the Iron Curtain, is that they mapped out, essentially they partitioned Germany into military occupation zones. This is very provisional. Essentially they were trying to estimate the striking power of the various armies and where they would arrive by the time that Germany surrendered. And the basic purpose of drawing the map this way was, to make sure that the armies were working in common coordination and not working at cross purposes. And they didn't end up too far from these lines. Those lines guided the approach of the armies as well. In some places, the United States was further into Eastern Europe than they had anticipated, and they withdrew. But the Russians withdrew as well from various areas of Austria. Now, the basic idea of Yalta is that this was just a provisional agreement. There'd be a military occupation of Germany, and these military occupation zones would agree, or there'd be kind of what they called an Allied Control Council, essentially an executive council that would coordinate the occupation of all Germany, including the trade between the various zones. Now, one of the things that they didn't reach an agreement on, except in principle, was on the question of reparations. Stalin's insisted on this very, very hard. The West rebuffed him, saw that his demands for Germany were unrealistic, but at least they agreed to a nominal figure of 8 billion German marks. And the idea that this is something that they would revisit at a later conference because they weren't able to reach agreement on it now. Perhaps the most bitter part of their dispute was relative to Poland, where the Soviet Union was insisting that the future government be communist and be predicated on the Lublin Poles, in other words, communist allies of the Soviet Union. The West was trying to insist that Stalin respect earlier agreements to create a coalition government with the London government in exile along with the Lublin Poles. Now, it was very clear that Stalin was not happy about this, even if he made some concessions in the Yalta Agreement. Finally, there was this very liberal charter about Eastern Europe, this Declaration on Liberated Europe, which made it sound like it was the culmination of the Atlantic Charter, that after World War II, the people would exercise their self-determination and determine the future of their state. But on this question, the future of Eastern Europe, the acrimony had been very hard. And it was very clear to the Western negotiations that Stalin was not interested in free elections and that he would not enable Eastern Europe to drift out of the Soviet orbit, no matter what the liberal language was in the Declaration of Liberated Europe. When it came to the actual agreement to hold free elections, he didn't budge and he refused to have this, only agreeing that the future of Eastern Europe, these governments would be anti-fascist and Moscow friendly, which was ultimately code words for saying, essentially Soviet satellites. So looking at the Yalta Accord, let's go back to our original question. Was Yalta the best deal possible in February 1945? In other words, the deal accomplished what it needed to do, which was to keep the big three together, and their armies advanced on Berlin, and Nazi Germany was wiped off the earth, and the Axis alliance was defeated. And that was the principal objective of the Grand Alliance anyway, and they achieved their core objective. So in that sense, should we more charitably say that the Yalta Agreement facilitated its end goal? Or could we argue that the Yalta Agreement was, in a way, an agreement to disagree and to leave the contentious issues that you couldn't resolve, Poland, representation, reparations, and the future of Eastern Europe, were not decided at Yalta. And because they were not decided at Yalta, they essentially hung over the Grand Alliance like a sword of Damocles. And if they weren't resolved at Yalta, there was really little chance they'd be resolved at a future conference at Potsdam once the Grand Alliance had achieved its core objective. So, in that sense, the Yalta Conference exposed the chill that would become the Cold War, even if it wasn't the Cold War yet. The very issues that would drive the gulf between the Stalin and the West were revealed. They were not resolved, and they would eventually become the breaking point of the Grand Alliance. So, relative to the Yalta Conference, how do you call it? Was it the best deal possible in 1945, or was it the beginning of the Cold War?